Hello and welcome to Saving People, Queering Things, the supernatural podcast where once again we have thoughts on a queer dean heart attack theory to talk about today. Today we are pulling up to season 4 with episode 6, Yellow Fever. I'm Abigail, one of your hosts, and my pronouns are they, them. And with me today we have a wonderful guest. Hayley, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us about your experience with Supernatural?
My name is Hayley and my pronouns are she, her. I started watching Supernatural in the summer of 2013, right after season 8 had finished airing. And I caught up over that summer and started watching when season 9 was live. And I watched pretty consistently as it was airing for a couple of seasons and took a little bit of a break and then caught up. And then by the time the finale aired, I was like fully invested again. So.
And you're pretty active on, like, we connected through Supernatural TikTok, which has been like kind of the new iteration of where the fandom has kind of ended up, which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really excited you're here because you had made a couple of videos about this particular episode, and I'm excited to get to unpack them a little bit when we get into the episode.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. But now that you've met us, we're going to catch up. So if you haven't watched Supernatural or this season recently, here is what you've missed on the road so far. First up, I'm going to recap the season 4 so far, the first 7 episodes. Yeah. Okay. Hayley, can you count me in for recapping the season?
Okay. 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay, so Dean is in hell, and then he is not. He is suddenly awake in a box in the ground, and he digs himself out, and it turns out that an angel named Castiel has rescued him for some grand heaven plan that's kind of unclear. Dean says he doesn't remember hell, but turns out he actually does. He's just not telling Sam about it. Sam and Ruby are doing suspicious things that are unclear, and Sam is lying to Dean about it. And Cass keeps telling Dean that he was saved for some heavenly purpose.
That was a very good recap.
Yeah, I'm like, I think that's everything.
Sounds good to me.
So now Hayley's going to recap this week's episode, which is Yellow Fever. Let me know when you're ready. No rush.
I don't know if I'll ever fully be ready, but let's try it. Let's go.
Okay. 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay, we cold open with Dean running across what looks like a parking lot being chased by a Yorkie. The next thing we know, 43 hours earlier, Sam and Dean are in a morgue and they're looking at this guy who supposedly died of a heart attack, but it wasn't really a heart attack. So they go talk to the sheriff, and the sheriff says the guy was like paranoid, freaking out. So they go talk to the guy's neighbor, who says the guy was also paranoid, freaking out. We think that it's Dean's got something wrong with him, it's ghost sickness, and they have to scare the ghost to death.
Nice. That was awesome.
I missed like the second half of the episode.
But you came in with clutch with the like, they have to scare the ghost. You like closed it off.
I tried. I realized there was about 8 seconds left, and I was like, oh no, I'm not gonna make it.
That's my problem anytime I do the episode recap. I'm always like, spend 20 seconds on setting it up and then go, oh, wait.
Yep. I got too many details in the first half. The second half, I just gave like 5 words.
You get there. So now that we're caught up, we're going to go into our episode mixtape. So every week we're collecting songs that remind us of these episodes. And at the end of the season, we'll have this beautiful mixtape of season 4. Yeah. Hayley, do you have a song for this episode?
I went back and forth because my brain would only give me Eye of the Tiger for obvious reasons. And I figured that's a given. That's too easy.
Yeah.
So I thought of Ghost Town by Adam Lambert.
Cool. Nice. I like it. It's very on theme for this episode. The song I'm going with is Eat You Alive by the Oh Hellos. It's also a song about like being haunted and chased by your fears. It feels very Dean coded. So
sounds good.
Yeah. So now that we've got our mixtape, it is time for this week's hunt and today's episode, which is Yellow Fever. And we're going to be talking about it through the theme of human nature. Yeah. Is there anywhere particular you would like to start with this episode?
One of the first things I had written down on my notes, because I was jumping straight into the queer reading.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
I kind of jumped straight to where they're talking to the sheriff, whose name I can't remember at the moment. And he's explaining to Sam and Dean how he knew Frank. And he was like, me and Frank, we were friends. And then he's like, we were Gamecocks, which was like the name of their softball team. which Dean immediately starts laughing about and making jokes about. And then the sheriff like puts him in his place and like he's like, you're a majestic animal and like all this stuff. But that was our first like gay joke of the episode.
Yeah, which is quite something for this episode. That's like it like is and isn't a humorous episode. And that joke comes back. Like also later on, that same joke plays out with corn jerkers as one of the other teams, which like, why? I would like to know.
Yeah, there's definitely a specific imagery they were going for with these team names.
And Sam's just like, whatever. And Dean's like, this is very funny to me, specifically funny to me. Yeah, the like first thing I noticed, we've talked a little bit about this on the podcast before, and I don't know if it's something that you are familiar with, the like recurring motif of like Dean being saved and or connected to people who have had heart attacks and the queer like implications of that, like going all the way back to faith. And this is another example of that. Like Dean literally holds the heart of someone who like died like by a quote unquote heart attack. And like, it turns out to not be quite as simple as that, but they are dying because they're of their fear. And it is like basically getting to the point where it stops their hearts. And it's just very interesting to me that Dean is being connected, like that Dean is the one that gets targeted in this episode.
Yeah, Dean is consistently throughout the whole show associated with heart and like literal hearts and like heart attack and heart problems and things like that. Like you said, it's safe, where he was saved by the heart of who was a gay man who dying of a heart attack for Dean to live. So like Sam is never really connected with hearts in that way, but Dean consistently is.
Yeah. And even like a lot of the times that different monsters or villains like will attack the boys when they're not like directly attacking them, when they're using, psychic abilities or whatever, like it's often heart related specifically for Dean. Like he's usually like clutching his chest, clutching his heart, and it doesn't happen as often with Sam. It's very, very interesting. And then, you think about like he's later on in the show connected to Cass and like the concept of hearts, and it's just very interesting.
Yeah.
I would love to hear about kind of the interpretation they give in this episode for why Dean is targeted. The interpretation Sam gives is like, they were all kind of dicks and like, it's a bully, it's a vice principal, bully, a vice principal, and the bouncer. And Sam's like, yeah, that's why you got targeted and I didn't get targeted. But I remember in the videos that you had made about this having kind of a different way of looking, a specifically queer way of like looking at this episode and Dean. And I would love to hear about that, talk about that.
Okay, so kind of what the thread that I was kind of following there is kind of going back to the way that they figure out the way the ghost sickness is being spread is through touch for the most part. It seems like through people. With like physical contact or like aerosol droplets, things like sneezing, things like that. Because Sam got infected with or he should have got infected by the spleen juice, and Dean, he didn't, and then Dean did get infected, presumably he either got infected from holding the heart, although he had gloves on, or he got infected. Isn't he the one that shook the sheriff's hand?
He's the one. He shakes the sheriff's hand.
So that's probably the implication of when he got infected. But starting out by saying that the way the disease started spreading was through this male softball team, and the softball teams both have what we've already discussed, very like
homoerotic names.
Yeah, like the Gamecocks and the Corn Jerkers, like that's their name. We're already associating these teams with queerness, and then we're saying that this disease is spread through, this sickness is spread through people that are associated with queerness, even though none of the characters are like explicitly queer. There's still a theme there.
Definitely.
And Sam and Dean were both exposed, but only Dean caught it. And like Sam's explanation to me reads a lot like a younger brother. He's just like, oh yeah, you're my big brother and you're mean. Like that's why you got it and I did it. He's almost tongue in cheek about it.
Yeah.
But
yeah. Sam is almost a little bit of a dick about it to Dean the rest of the episode, where he's kind of like, well, it's kind of your fault that you got sick, Dean. Like I didn't get sick, so that means like, I don't know, like something about you. Yeah.
And I feel like I've tried to think back. There's been a common thread in the earlier seasons of sicknesses being queer coded spreading through people and creatures and things like that, and supernatural, for better or for worse. And this kind of rang similar to me, just looking at the subtext and the meta of like how they're framing the spreading of this infection. And then we get to the end, of course, and the things that Lilith is saying, like to tell Dean, like, you know why you got infected, like listen to your heart, Dean. And like at that time, we didn't know why. The viewer wasn't supposed to know why.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, they don't specifically call back to this moment to link the two events of why he got infected, even though we're supposed to believe that Dean knows for some secret reason. And to me, the phrasing of listen to your heart, and then Dean not actually like replying of like what he thinks Lilith is telling him, I don't know. It feels like there's something they didn't actually come out and say to us.
I think that is the part that feels really the nail in the coffin for that interpretation, because he's also asking the questions of like, why me, which kind of is echoing the question he asked, is like the questions he's asked to Cass about like, why was he rescued from hell? Like, obviously there's stuff about his time in hell that we're going to find out later that is also connected to this, but I think it makes sense that it could be more than one thing. And the listen to your heart, especially when we've seen that connected already to Dean's queer coding, is, I think, really, really interesting. And, you know,
I feel like there's definitely a way to view it the way that Kripke intended it to be read as canon for why, but that doesn't take away from the queer reading of it, because the meta of Dean being associated with hearts and the symbolism of that also associated with queerness just feels to me like you can read that into this. It's not like they're mutually exclusive.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like we see with the other victims, also these concepts of people not being what they seem, like people not being what you perceive them to be on the outside. You know, someone might be perceived to be, you know, an upstanding citizen, but actually they're a murderer. Someone might have been seen as this outcast or this weirdo or this stalker, but actually was just this really gentle and kind person who like didn't deserve what happened to them. The idea that like Dean is also not seen the way he really is, and that's somewhat like the way he's built his persona, is very easy to read queerness into that.
Oh, I hadn't thought about this actually going down this trail. In this episode, I feel like we are with Dean, we see two different aspects of how this ghost sickness is affecting him. We see the fear side, which is the obvious one. That's like, he's afraid of dogs, he's afraid of going back to hell, he's afraid of Lilith, Sam becoming a demon. Like all of these things manifest as his fears. And he's also afraid of heights and things like that now.
It's all very classic Dean. It's kind of great. They covered all the bases.
Yeah, but I feel like there's another aspect that I didn't notice until I rewatched it this time. It's not just Dean's fear we're seeing, it's his vulnerability and his honesty, a lot of his inhibitions and the ways that he would immediately put up a wall in certain situations, they're all gone. And that doesn't have to do with some of the things he did in this episode weren't because he was afraid. It's just because he didn't have a filter.
Yeah, I actually noticed that as well. Like Dean really hates being vulnerable and scared, but he doesn't really get a choice in this episode because it's all sort of like brought to the surface. And I even noticed how he like masks some of the fear and vulnerability by like over exaggerating it. So like when he does like the really high pitched screaming, I'm like, that's not real. That's, I think, him playing up in some ways the fear, because that masks the actual like vulnerability, because we see him when he's actually afraid earlier, and we see when he does when he's actually afraid, which is like he drinks, he makes jokes, he's sometimes forced into sharing bits of himself that he doesn't want to. He doesn't care about food, which we know like is a big sign that he's not doing okay. He's like actually really freaked out about being haunted. And, you know, we get all these hell flashbacks kind of flipped with these like over exaggerated fear moments that I think are him playing up. If he seems more scared of dumb things, then he can be less vulnerable about the things he's actually scared about, because he doesn't actually really want to let Sam know the things he's actually afraid of.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. I have never read it that way before, like him playing up the sillier fears, but it makes total sense with Dean's characterization. If he can take some sort of control over the situation that he's in, then that makes him feel better. Like whenever Sam asked him, like, what did you see? And he says, howler monkeys. Like, obviously he was just making a joke to try to like hide the truth. And
Sam knows it too. Like the way Sam looks at him, like Sam knows he's lying, but Sam's also like, yeah, you are not able to say what you're really afraid of. And Dean even goes, you know, like, I don't know, you saw it, like, I see the usual, like, and yeah, it's very interesting. It's funny because like this episode was one that I thought I didn't like very much until actually seeing a couple of your videos on it. And I was like, ooh, this is an interpretation that I like a lot better, because I think the way the episode wants us to think about this is that like, it's because Dean is this particular kind of persona that's kind of a bully and a jerk. But that's when you flip it and it's not actually about that anymore. This episode totally changes. And so I really loved this episode because it showed that vulnerability and all of the triggers that Dean has and all of the ways that he doesn't want to be, you know, that like so many of his biggest fears are about him being the bad guy or him being the bully. And like that, so much of that comes from hell, comes from like the way John treated him, like all of these things. Yeah, I liked this episode a lot more this time, like looking at it a little differently.
Yeah, I think the first few times I watched it, I just saw it, it's like one of the funnier episodes, like episodes of Supernatural, like there wasn't a lot of substance to it. But when you really start digging into it, there's like, oh, there's a lot to Dean's characterization here.
Yeah, this episode ends up on a lot of lists of like funniest Supernatural episodes. And like watching it now, I'm like, how? Like other than the scenes where he's running from the Yorkie, I'm like, those are funny, but they're also not.
Yeah.
Think about why he's scared of a Yorkie, because he's scared of a Yorkie because of massive hellhound trigger, which is just not actually very funny once you think about it, like at all.
Yep.
They really made a choice to do an episode about fear and kind of like laugh about Dean's fear, like right after he's been in hell for like 40 years, which is a choice that they made.
I feel like it was an interesting choice to make it his fear into this comedic thing for like a like Monster of the Week episode, whenever it's something that he's suffering a lot of trauma with. Like I know a lot of times Monster of the Week episodes are used to explore darker and deeper themes in a lighter way and like an easier way to parse out, but it almost, I don't know, it comes a little bit, it's a little bit insensitive to me, to Dean's very real fear and trauma.
That's how I think that's why I've never really loved this episode, because I was like, it's supposed to be funny, but it's not. And I liked it better when I looked at it as like the narrative wants you to think it's funny, but when you actually think about the layers of it for Dean, both from like the queer angle and just the trauma angle and all of these other things, like he's confronting some parts of himself unwillingly, like he's being forced to confront some parts of himself that are really, really scary. And it's pushing all this vulnerability to the surface. And he's kind of alone in it because Sam is a little bit insensitive about it.
Yeah, I also
like the whole episode.
I also noted that down, that Sam was a little bit insensitive. And like, I think part of the issue is that Dean is always the older brother who like takes the reins. And when Sam's having a moment, Dean is there for him. And Dean's the one to be like, okay, let's do this. And he just takes charge of the situation. Sam's never really had to be in that position before, at least not often that we've seen. So it stands out to me whenever they're at the lumber mill and he automatically like hands the gun over his shoulder to Dean, and he looks around, Dean's like, no, I'm not taking that. And Sam kind of has to realize like, okay, I'm gonna have to just tell Dean what to do, and like I'm gonna have to lead the situation, and he's not very good at it.
No, it's like this role reversal. And I think like later in the show we get that more, but like at this point we haven't had that a lot, where like Sam has had to take charge over Dean and like be responsible for Dean's safety. And I mean, it's like that whole parent-child thing, like Dean is in so many ways Sam's parent, and suddenly Sam is having to kind of be Dean's parent, and he's not very good at it. You're right. He's kind of like, there's a few scenes where I'm like, why did you bring Dean along for this? Why did you bring him along? This was not going to end well. Like, of course he's going to say dumb shit to like, it's going to blow your cover. Like,
you know, we were talking about how we were going to make this episode somehow about Cass. I actually just thought about how funny it is that when they go to introduce themselves as FBI agents, Dean's like having a little meltdown about his badge and handing his badge over, and Sam has to like look at him and make him hand his badge. That reminds me of Dean and Cass with the whole like Dean trying to go on a hunt with Cass, and Sam and Cass is just like not a natural when it comes to stuff like that.
Cass is so bad at faking being an FBI agent. Yeah, that's good. I love that parallel. It's like, I think I like seeing human nature is kind of the theme, and we've been talking about like kind of all around that for this discussion, but like seeing Dean kind of stripped down to like who he is without his persona is, I think, one of the things that I really like in this episode. He's able to say things like, you know, I'm done with monsters and hellhounds and ghost sicknesses and the apocalypse. Like, he's like, I did not want any part of this. he's able to like have like the panic attacks and the hallucinations that we know he usually stuffs down and like muffles with hunting. And it is even like him and the deputy, you know, not everyone sees that scene as like flirting, but I think you can see it as flirting, like the way he interacts with the deputy, and like he's a combination of drunk and ghost sick, but he turns on that like charm that we often see him do with women.
No, I definitely, I've always read that as flirting. Like, I feel like it's on the second rewatch, or this is more than my second time watching this, but on this rewatch, I noticed at the beginning, I forgot the deputy was in the episode earlier on whenever they first go to visit the sheriff. He's the one that like lets them in to go see the sheriff. And in that like brief interaction, he's like grinning really big at Dean, and then Dean just kind of like nods his head and just like smiles a little bit, but kind of like awkward, what are you looking at type of thing. And then later, whenever he's staying there talking to him, he's just like, you're awesome. Like the deputy was definitely like flustered. Like the deputy thought Dean was flirting with him, whether Dean was or not. So
oh yeah, he doesn't know how to react because Dean's all like giggly and like his inhibitions are gone.
Dean's acting super giggly and like excited that he's happy that the deputy is like giggling at him, and they're having a whole moment before Sam like drags him out.
Yeah. And it's that combination, I think, just with Dean's inhibitions gone, whenever his inhibitions are gone, and we've seen this like earlier on the show, we'll like continue to see it, the way he interacts with men, not all men, but the way he interacts with some men is also the way he interacts with some women when he doesn't have those same like things that are like holding back. It's, yeah, I can't not see it now, you know, especially when you take it in context of like every other interaction he has with men where you're like, yeah, he's flirting. Yeah. Like this is very much like that, or very much like when he puts the moves on with girls.
Because I've seen a lot of people talk about how Dean's really good at making the first move, but if someone flirts back with him, he gets super flustered and doesn't know how to handle it.
Just like panics.
Yeah, it seemed like the same sort of situation to me where he was just like, I'm gonna say something to this guy. Then the guy like got giggly and said, well, you're awesome too. And then Dean just like had no response.
It's like deer in the headlights, especially when it's men too. Like he has an easier time reacting if a girl flirts back, but when it's a guy, it's like even more amped out. Like he doesn't do well. He just kind of freaks out and freezes and goes like, oh, like because he likes to flirt, and he like says that in the show. He says that he like likes to flirt, and even like other characters point out to him later on. Like there's a season 14 scene that's happening entirely in his mind where a character that's a product of his subconscious says to him like, you just like to flirt. Mm-hmm. And I think that, yeah, he likes to flirt, but he doesn't always know what to do with reciprocation, because reciprocation means that he has to like actually confront his own feelings, especially when it's, you know, not a woman.
I feel like with women, with coming from like a cis man flirting with a cis woman, there's a certain script there. There's a dynamic that's kind of established that Dean goes into it expecting that dynamic to play out. But when it's men, he just doesn't, like every time I can ever picture that a man has flirted with him or flirted back with him, he just blue screens like error 404. He's speechless.
Yeah, it's my favorite trope in like Destiel fics, or just like supernatural fics in general, where Dean's queerness is explored, is him blue screening whenever anyone flirts back, because I think it's so well represented in the show that he doesn't know what the, like you said, I think the script part, there's no predetermined script of like who takes charge, who makes the first move, how do you respond. He just sort of like does the things he would do with anyone, but he also doesn't, I think he always usually is the one pursuing. So when he's being pursued back, especially by someone who, you know, where there isn't that role established, he doesn't know what to do with that. And he often just then goes, and then he gets very, he gets in this episode, he gets kind of giggly, he gets kind of like shy, he gets kind of like flustered, like, I don't know what to do. Someone else take charge. Mm-hmm. Someone else make a decision. Like,
yeah, it's funny that Sam didn't even say anything. He just shows up and grabs Dean's arm. He's like, let's go.
Sam being oblivious. I think Sam just thinks it's the ghost sickness and the alcohol. That's like, Sam does not see what's going on in this episode for Dean, like really at all. No. Sam's very case focused right now. And I love Sam, but he's a little dense in this episode.
He wasn't very sympathetic and didn't really get a lot of what Dean was going through. I think like giving Sam a little bit of benefit of the doubt, Dean always is the one who takes the lead in these situations, and he doesn't ever willingly unless he's at a really low point, he doesn't usually willingly like confront his fears and feelings with Sam, even though Sam's used to trying to get Dean to confront his feelings, and then Dean blows him off with some sort of like remark. But in this episode, Dean wasn't even trying to hide it. He was just, he couldn't hide how he was feeling and what he was scared of. So whenever Dean, like you said earlier, when Dean did those like over exaggerated displays of fear over silly things, part of that maybe was helping Sam like feel a little more comfortable. And Sam was like, oh, it's just Dean being silly. Like, I can laugh about this.
Right.
But that
he can take it less seriously.
But that meant that he didn't actually take very seriously some of the stuff that Dean was actually scared of and the ways he was actually manifesting his fear of dying again.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I don't think it's an intentional Sam not caring thing. It's actually Dean still managing to have a bit of a persona with his brother, because it's just,
he's letting Sam slip back into that little brother role a little bit, and Sam's kind of taking that chance.
Yeah, it's almost easier for both of them if they can stick to those roles, because then they don't have to. And I think Dean knows that like if he gives in to that fear, it starts to consume him. And like as the episode goes on and it gets closer and closer, I couldn't help but like pick up on all of the parallels to season 3, episode 16. Like there's so many parallels of like he's looking at the book and he's seeing weird things, he's like hallucinating things, he's having a panic attack. You know, all of those are things that happened to him in the like 24-hour countdown. He's like obsessed with the sound of the clock. All of those are really present for him more and more in this episode.
I feel like the main thing that stood out to me was the way that, because I was kind of looking at it through a queer lens, but it's not just queer, it's just kind of the othering of Luther, whether it said that whether it's because he has some sort of like neurodivergency, like a mental developmental disorder, something like that. It's not really said, but they basically just say his brother says that he's just like a weirdo and the town writes him off and they refuse to try to understand him. And I don't know about you, but I'm originally from a small town in the South in the US, and I've definitely seen examples of people who very clearly could benefit with some kind of help psychiatrically or medically or something like that, but they're just kind of written off as like the town weirdo, and people avoid them. And that's way too common of a theme, and it seems to be what they're implying happened here, is that Luther was just too weird and no one understood him. They were scared of him, so they just made him like this outsider.
Yeah, that was like one of the things that made me the most sad watching this episode was the idea that Luther was probably neurodivergent in some way. Was just like I couldn't ignore it, and I like have seen that before when I've watched this episode, but it was like really hard to ignore this time. And the fact that instead of like seeing him as a full human, everyone has just sort of been like he's scary because of his outward appearance, because you know he's this big guy who looks scary, and like his brother says, you know, he wouldn't have hurt, he was super kind and gentle, like wouldn't have hurt anyone. You know, the fact that he had like really fixated on, I don't remember what her name is, on
I think it's Jessie. Yeah,
the fact that he had really fixated on Jessie, I was like, that's also just, you know, someone was kind to him, someone treated him like a full human, and he really like latched onto that as like a person who wasn't othering him. And yeah, I've also seen that othering in communities where instead of someone being welcomed in just as they are, they're instead made to be like villainized. And that's what happens with Luther, is that like they're like, oh, you're different, so there's something wrong with you. And it's easy to like make you the scapegoat for the things that we're afraid of. And that's what Frank does. I had a little bit of an issue with the way Luther's brother like talks about it. And like, I get he's trying to find some peace with the situation, with like this awful situation that he's never gotten any justice for. But he talks about how Frank was like afraid and freaking out because his wife had disappeared. And he sort of goes like, oh, I've forgiven him because, you know, he was also going through a thing. But I was like, that's not, I'm sorry, you know, yes, he was scared about what had happened to his wife and his wife had disappeared, but he had no, you know, he went right to like violence towards a marginalized person and like a super vulnerable person. And not just like he went towards violence, but he went towards like really graphic, really prolonged violence. And that like I couldn't watch that scene when I rewatched this episode. Like I had to physically look away and not be watching that scene, because, or the scene at the end when they're recreating that, because I was like, this is just like horrific. And that is not excusable for Frank because he was scared himself.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure what they said that his wife had just disappeared and they found her later, but he had no evidence at that point that there was any foul play.
Exactly.
He had no reason to suspect Frank, except that Frank like had some sort of like attachment to Jesse because she was nice to him. But he had no reason to all of a sudden just jump straight to violence. And like you said, to me it feels less like he thought he was justified and more like it was an excuse to act out on his already existing like prejudices. And
yeah,
he already didn't like Luther. And he already wanted to act on that in some way, probably. And it's like you said, he was an easy scapegoat. It was like, oh, well, something happened. It was probably that guy.
Yeah, it's so easy to like blame someone else for the reason that you're feeling angry or violent or scared. And I agree. That's exactly, I think, what's happening. And I think it's unfortunate that the episode doesn't take a little bit of a stronger stance on that, because I think they do a good job of showing that like Luther wasn't the villain. But at the same time, the solution to this situation in the end is them basically re-traumatizing the ghost until it's gone. And like Sam says at the end that like it was really horrific, like it's really horrible that this is what we had to do. But I really just hate the solution of like traumatize the already traumatized. And I don't know if they could have done differently. It just like highlights the like unfairness of so many of the things that Sam and Dean encounter. Like there's not a happy ending for Luther.
Yeah, there's no real justice in any of the situation because Luther was unfairly killed in a very traumatic way.
Mm-hmm.
And then he ends up, the reason that he stayed back as a ghost is because I think they touched on before that a lot of times ghost people stick around and turn to angry spirits because they died in like a really unfair, unjust way, and they have like unfinished business they can't let go of.
Yeah.
And that's, I think we're supposed to assume that's why he infected Frank with the ghost sickness, because Frank was the one that killed him.
I guess so. And it's kind of unclear as to why it's like ghost sickness instead of just like regular angry spirit killing.
Yeah.
Because it feels ghost sickness feels less in his control. Like it feels more like it's also strange because it's like the only time, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's like the only time we see something like this very specifically. It was an interesting choice to make it like a transmissible sickness.
Yeah, that's true, because a lot of times when people stick around because they have some like unfinished business, they're just like violently haunting someone. They're not, it doesn't manifest itself as ghost sickness.
Yeah, like this makes it almost seem, actually, I think I prefer that to I think if they had made him just like an angry, violent ghost, that would have lent more to the like him being responsible for this. I think it being ghosting, this feels way more out of his control. He's further being marginalized again, even in his death, because it's accidentally created this sickness that now is spreading, almost like the hatred and prejudice that was inflicted on him is now being spread through his death to other people, including people who have nothing to do with it, like Dean, like some of the other members of the softball team, presumably, like he's not an angry spirit in the way that he's like just targeting, which makes Sam's explanation even more flimsy of like, they were all dicks. You don't know that just because someone's like a vice principal or a bouncer, like doesn't actually mean that they're a dick. Like we know the sheriff, we know like Frank was, and we know some of the characters are, but like not all of them are, presumably. And Sam maybe just doesn't get exposed. Sometimes you just don't get sick. Sam's immune system is just stronger.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, like in real life with illnesses, two people can be standing in the same room together and one of them will get sick and the other won't. That doesn't mean that there was something specific that Sam had some kind of like hyper immunity to it.
No, or maybe it's the demon blood. Maybe that's why Sam's immune.
Maybe.
I could buy that would be why. Like Sam's just a little bit less likely to get any kind of like demonic or evil sickness because he's got demon blood immunity.
That's a pretty good explanation. I've never thought of that, but that makes sense. He's not like fully human.
Yeah.
I feel like with the other characters, though, one person who gets skipped over really quickly in this episode is Jessie, the wife. I don't even think she has any dialogue, but we only see her like briefly. But she went out of her way to be kind to this person. As far as we know, she was one of the only people who ever went out of her way to be kind to Luther, because she saw that he was harmless. People were being unfairly cruel to him, and she just wanted to be a friend to him. And she didn't ask for any of this situation to happen to her. She didn't ask for this violent love triangle to occur because of her situation. And we don't know, I mean, we know we hear why they say that, like, what happened to her, but we still don't know her story and what happened there. But I wish we could have gotten a little bit more perspective on her role in this, because in a lot of ways she was a catalyst in this situation between Frank and Luther, but we don't really know anything about her or like what was actually going on there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, we know that she was struggling a lot. I think this episode is a really good example of like the fact that people with neurodivergency and mental illness are like much more likely to be the victims than to be the perpetrators of violence. Like, both in Luther's case and in Jesse's case, like they are both victims of their circumstances and of things that are going on outside of their control. And both of them, the main things we know about them, like, you know, very little other than that they were like kind people. And even the fact that they bonded coming from the fact that Jesse was kind. And like, we think of it, I think it's easy to be like, you know, Jesse was kind to Luther, but Luther was also kind to her. They just seemed like they had an actually like mutually reciprocal, respectful, caring relationship. And like, we don't know much about Frank, but based on his actions after Jesse goes missing, like, I'm not guessing he was a super kind person, you know?
Didn't Frank's neighbor say that he bullied half the town whenever they were in high school, and he has a history of physical and like emotional violence and abuse?
Yeah, so like the chances that Jessie, I wish, yeah, like you said, I wish we knew more about her and like what was going on in her story, because it also seems likely that she was also a victim of Frank before she got caught in this situation. Yeah. And that's really tragic.
I was thinking about that while I watched it this time around, because someone who will jump straight to a violent murder because his wife is missing comes across as a very controlling and likely at least emotionally abusive person. Mm-hmm. And we know he was a bully and not the nicest person just in general, but it seems to me that there was probably more going on at home there.
Yeah.
And that maybe she connected with Luther because, like you said, she was also a victim in a lot of ways, and she was also treated badly. And I can't remember, didn't they say that she had bipolar?
Yeah, they say, yeah, Dean says at one point, once they've done a little research, she says she was a manic depressive. So yeah, like the chances that it was bipolar, something in that realm.
Okay. So I mean, yeah, the fact that she has some sort of neurodivergency and was able to connect with Luther, that probably had a lot to do with her feeling a little bit othered by her, because manic depressive episodes can be very extreme sometimes and
super isolating.
Yeah, it can be isolating, and you can do things in those episodes that you wouldn't normally do if you're having like a regulated like emotional state, and you have to live with the consequences of that, or you just feel bad. It's not a good feeling to be out of control of your own emotion.
Yeah.
And I feel like she probably was able to look at Frank and be like, he's not doing anything to deserve any of this. It's out of his control. And like, she was able to show a lot more mercy and kindness to him. And I just really wish that we've seen more of her character, because I feel like there's a whole other story there.
Yeah, I wish we'd got to see more of her, and like, other than that one shot, we don't get to see her and Luther interact and like seeing how they had been a kindness in each other's lives, which seems like both of them needed. They were in this small town. She was married to this person who was a bully. He was bullied by the whole town. He was ostracized. Like, they maybe legitimately only had each other. And, you know, like, you think about like they worked together, kind of worked in the same building. And I also like think about Luther, of like how hard it must have been like, it doesn't take very long between when she goes missing and when he's killed, but like in that time he is also going to be grieving her loss and also going to be terrified at her like disappearing. Like, that's also something that he would have had to suffer through before he's ever blamed for what happens to her. And like, it's just really, I wish we had gotten to see more of that, because I think also it kind of like lends strength to the theory that like the ghost sickness is more, you know, for Dean in particular, is not about him being anything like Frank. It's actually more about him being similar to Jesse and to Luther. It's more also about him also being isolated and ostracized and like othered by various communities for his experiences, for his trauma, for his queerness. He's also doesn't have people to confide in about the things he's really experienced.
Yeah, and like you were saying earlier about how Frank and all of these other people who've been infected, it seems like there's some sort of a sheriff and all of them, there's some sort of like hidden side to them. There's some sort of like secret they have that's being drawn out to the surface, that this ghost sickness is kind of highlighting. And with Dean, I think we really see that in that little breakdown he has towards the end where he's ranting and yelling about, like, we seek out the things that want to kill us, like, you know, who does that? Crazy people. And he's like, he just starts naming off a whole list of things that are like day-to-day parts of their lives and that he actually like secretly hates, and that he pretends to enjoy and play up about himself and about their lives, but in reality he's trapped in it and he feels like he doesn't have another choice. And it's interesting to me that he brought up the waitress in the diner, which is like a staple of Dean's like playboy personality, where all he wants to do is like hook up with a waitress and then leave town. But that things like that are all lumped into this whole concept of his life that he has to pretend to enjoy. But now that he's like stripped of all of his like inhibitions and all of his walls, he can finally admit to Sam in this moment of like a lot of vulnerability, because he just can't bring himself to hide it anymore, like how much he hates having to be this person.
It's that like persona being stripped away, and like I feel like that's come up so much in these first few seasons, that Dean presents this persona of, I love the life that I have, like this is the family business, this is like, oh, you know, I get all these little bits of joy out of like, hooking up with waitresses and like, you know, being on the road and not answering to anyone. But we know from back in season 1 and season 2, like we know that that's not, that he feels really, really trapped, and this persona gets stripped away unwillingly. And he acknowledges that even the things that he uses to cope, the things that he calls fun, are actually also equally trapping him, you know? And if we think about that, like from even the queer lens too, like he's trapped in this like compulsory heterosexuality where to maintain this image of himself as a man, he's gotta like hook up with random girls at diners, he's gotta like be a bit of a player, you know? And he seems so pulled to that until it's revealed that he like that's equally something trapping him.
Yeah, it brings me back to like, I think it was season 2 or season 3 in the Jen episode, the what it was, what is and what should never
season
be.
2.
Like how whenever we see Dean in a situation where he gets the choice, he almost always doesn't want the life that he has. It becomes immediately clear that everything he's clinging so hard to right now, he's holding on to it because he doesn't think he has anything left without it.
It's because he doesn't feel like he has a choice, like either because of the circumstances placed upon him or because of what it would cost for the rest of the world if he walked away. Like he doesn't feel like there's any other option for him. And right now, particularly at this point in season 4, he's being told that like heaven and God has plans for him, that there's like some kind of apocalypse coming, that he's been rescued for a reason, like he's come out of hell, but he is now, there's even more weight. And then there's all this stuff with Sam that he doesn't know what's happening. Sam is like got this darker edge to him since he came back. We see his greatest fear is like Sam becoming a demon. And there's a lot that he's like really scared of that gets highlighted. And it's a really interesting character study.
I feel like this kind of plays into the overall theme of season 4 and season 5, the free will versus destiny.
Yes.
Because we see Dean wanting out, like whenever he feels like he's done with this, the ghost sickness is progressing and he can't like really, his fears are taking over, and he's like, I don't want to be a part of any of this, like I want out, I just want to walk away, which is sort of a common trope. I think it's part of the hero's journey, if I'm not mistaken. Where the hero is like, nope, I can't do this. I'm not the chosen one. This is not for me. I quit. And then something drags them back in.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's a technical part of a hero's journey, but it's a common trope in those type of stories. And I feel like this sort of Dean's moment where he's like, nope, I quit. I'm done. If I just say I'm done, this doesn't affect me anymore. But then he kind of realizes like the hallucinations start and all of that. And he's like, okay, well, I'm stuck here. And even his Sam hallucination, the Sam demon is telling him like, well, you're going back to hell. It's about time. Like this is always going to happen. Like Dean deserves to go back to hell. That's where he's going to be. And
it's always connected to his identity.
Yeah, like it kind of wraps itself back around to this idea of destiny. Like Dean can't avoid this destiny that's waiting for him, And I feel like it's kind of, we see that struggle a little bit here where Dean's like, actually, I want out. I want no part of this. But in the end, he's like, I can't escape it.
Yeah, at the end of the day, he's stuck in it because of, destiny, because of their free will being taken away, because of all of these circumstances that mean that they don't have an answer yet. And it's the rest of the season is going to keep unfolding that, like, Dean's resistance to the concept of destiny. And like we've already seen that little bits and pieces with Cass and his interactions with Cass, where Cass is like, this is the way things are going to be. This is why you were rescued. And Dean's like, I don't know how I don't like that. I don't want that. I didn't ask for that. And that's a tension that is like just starting to build up. And I like seeing it from just Dean's perspective in this episode, like aside from anyone else, like this is all internal. Like none of this is happening from, it's all internal based on this ghost sickness, which is cool. I think the ghost sickness is a weird concept in general, but it's a cool one for what it does in this episode.
Yeah.
I'd like one more little thought. And it's a pretty small one, but when Dean's having in the like one of the final scenes when he's having the like panic and freak out, he picks up a Bible to help ground him. And I think that's so interesting in this season because we've just been introduced to like the concepts of like angels and being rescued and like God intervening and like angels intervening and good things do happen, Dean. And like all of that. And I just think that is such a character shift for him. Like we never would have seen that in earlier seasons.
Yeah, it's really, even looking at it now, I'm not sure I fully understand it. Like it's an interesting choice because especially at this point, I mean, Dean doesn't really trust Cass all that much. He knows that Cass isn't quite like the other angels, but they're not friends. He doesn't really trust them. And he doesn't really have a reason to. And Dean is very resistant to the idea that there's God and there's goodness. Like even in the earlier seasons, he refuses to believe that angels could be real because how could there be a God and a heaven if all of this exists down here?
Yeah, and he sort of reluctantly admitted in the first couple episodes of the season, he sort of reluctantly admitted that like, okay, it probably makes sense that there is a God based on all the evidence, but he doesn't like it.
Yeah, he's still, even if he has to forcibly like admit that angels exist at the very least because Cass was sitting in front of him.
Yeah.
He doesn't like them. He doesn't trust them. He doesn't think that they're actually good guys. So it's interesting to me that they would have Dean clutching a Bible like in this. Maybe it's just because he's so scared of hell.
I think so.
And that he knows how bad hell is. And Cass is the one who pulled him out of hell. And he's like, for whatever reason they did it, the angels were the ones who saved him from that. And maybe that's just some sort of like little semblance of hope he's clutching onto to ground himself.
I think it's something like that. And yeah, I don't fully get it either, but I think I like it from also knowing where they're going to continue to develop that storyline. It's an interesting like shift towards faith in something, even if it's very reluctant, resistant faith at this point.
Yeah, because I don't think the Dean of earlier seasons would have found any comfort at all from a Bible.
No, I think that's like very much the opposite. Yeah, so I think that kind of wraps up our main episode discussion. So we're going to move into our Going Meta section where we are tracking lore, representation, behind the scenes trivia, and anything else that we want to talk about. So first off, we have our representation check. So this includes things like the Bechdel test, how this episode handles marginalized communities and things like that. We've talked a bunch about kind of how this episode handles neurodivergency and trauma. Is there anything else that we haven't already kind of talked about?
I will say that I know you mentioned the Bechdel test on this podcast, and I noticed there was not a single woman in this episode who had dialogue aside from Lilith at the end. The entire episode was men with a single shot of Jessie where she did not speak, and then Lilith at the end.
It would have cost them literally nothing to have some females in some scenes interacting.
There were like 5 or 10 side characters in this episode, and every single one of them were men. Like, how did who let that happen?
Yeah, it's not surprising, but it is frustrating because you lose some of the opportunity for like nuance, and you don't have any other gender represented.
I'm pretty sure everyone in this episode was white as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're right about that.
I can't think of any characters in this episode that had any significant screen time that I would remember that weren't white.
No one that had dialogue, I don't think. Yeah, it's a not a good episode for any of that.
No, it's not. It does not have representation outside of white cis men at all.
Yeah, unfortunate. Well, moving along, I was looking into the lore, and you said you have a point you want to make about lore.
I don't remember or know that much about the Buruburu spirit. I'm really bad at pronouncing that.
I think that was right. I think that's how I said in the episode.
I just think it, like road hauling, as Dean put it, a ghost, asked some interesting questions about the metaphysics of this ghost, because
yes,
because typically ghosts aren't corporeal. Like,
yeah,
I'm pretty sure if it's not established yet, it will be established in later seasons that it takes a lot of effort for a spirit to be able to physically manifest and do things with their physical
I think that's already been established.
So it's really strange to me that we're supposed to believe that this ghost in particular, you can just put a rope around their neck and like that will have any effect on them.
Well, and also, isn't it an iron chain?
Yeah, it was an iron chain.
That usually repels ghosts like instantly. That does not.
Yeah,
that doesn't work. Even if because I know Sam says, oh, like Robbie and I put a bunch of spell work on it, but that shouldn't cancel out the fact that like iron repels ghosts. That's their whole thing. That's the whole strategy half the time, is for them to like shoot it with iron rounds so that they can like dispel it until they can get rid of it.
And we actually see Sam do that when we first meet Luther.
So it's not like Luther's immune.
Yeah, the first time we meet Luther's ghost, Sam shoots him with iron, or rock salt or whatever he has. He shoots him with the ghost gun.
Inconsistent in the same episode. That's infuriating.
Yeah. Yeah, and like you said, we see a lot of times they'll have like an iron rod or something, or like a fireplace poker or something they'll use to like swing at ghosts, and that makes them disappear. So why would the iron chain not immediately like make Luther disappear?
Yeah, and it's also like a little strange. Like I never really understood why the spell work needed to be involved on the iron chain, because the whole thing is that they just need to scare him. I know, like, why would you need spell work? Like, it's just a little bit. They did a lot of work around the like what the ghost sickness looks like. They did not do any work to make the actual getting rid of the ghost make any logical sense in the lore of the show. It's very much lost canon sort of thing.
Yeah, I feel like I had this thought earlier. I feel like it would have made the story and the narrative and the lore make more sense if it would have just had him be a traditional ghost, but they had to burn the bones somehow, and then we always have that fake out moment where the bones didn't work and they need to find something else. And like I feel like we still could have gotten across the metaphor for all of Dean's issues if we had done that, maybe. But
I think so.
I also get that the ghost sickness was being used as a specific tool to show fear being spread.
I think they could have done ghost sickness still well, and they could have come up with a different way of like, they could have still done the burn the bones, because the only reason they don't do that is because they're like, they don't have his remains are spread out, but they could have like gotten around that by like, I don't know, just finding a different way to like have him die in the first place. Like there's probably multiple ways they could have done it that wouldn't have boxed them into this solution.
Yeah, they literally went out of their way to make it the most complicated and like nonsensical explanation they could think of. And I feel like that also, we talked about earlier how the way that to get rid of his ghost was to re-traumatize him. They did that on purpose. They didn't have to go that way.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it makes this episode more, it makes it like worse for everyone involved, including the metaphors that are like applying to Dean, when the fact that the only way to stop this is like, the only way to stop fear is with more fear, which the whole point of like this, and the reason this ghost sickness even started was because someone who was afraid chose violence, and someone weaponized their fear to be violent. The only way to stop that is to again weaponize fear. And I think that undercuts their message a little bit. It's very fatalistic.
Yeah, there was definitely a troubling moral message in this episode for sure.
Yeah, I appreciate that we like talked about some ways to interpret it a little bit differently, because I think I appreciate those, but it does highlight that the writing was going in a direction that is not great.
They went out of their way to be really cruel to marginalized people, and like they didn't have to wrap it up that way. The lore would have made more sense if they hadn't.
Yeah, exactly. It would have actually, and then they could have also like brought back, I do wish that like this had been something that they hadn't like immediately lost canon, because the concept of ghost sickness is really interesting, and there's other ways they could have used it. I can think of other plot lines later on in the show where it could have been interesting, and it's just like another way for spirits to manifest, as opposed to your typical angry spirit that we usually get. But obviously that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I was going to say, did we ever see ghost sickness again? Because I don't think so.
No, we never see it again. And yeah, again, the fact that it's a burrow spirit, like why is it that instead of something else? It's a like the common supernatural problem of like, we have a really interesting concept, but we are not going to use it again ever, and we're not going to explain why we never use it again.
I can definitely think of plot lines later on in the show, but this would have been a really good like tool to explore some of what was going on. But
yeah, fear and free will are like so heavy in this episode, and like those are continually going to be themes that they could have used this as a like plot device to help us. Like I would have loved to have seen ghost sickness again, but like have Sam experiencing it. I can think of some like plot lines where that would have really helped us understand also what Sam was going through.
Yeah, because I feel like a lot of these plot specific Monster of the Week episodes like this tend to affect Dean, but I feel like if they had brought some of those same ones that affected Dean back, now that we understand how they work, and applied them to Sam, it really would have given us more into his character. But a lot of times they would just find something really cool and then never use it again, so we didn't get to see the reversal of that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's unfortunate. I mean, that's what fanfic is for, but
Yep.
The only other like important lore piece is that this is the episode where we get it confirmed that time in hell passes differently than time on Earth, and that it felt like 40 years. So now we officially know that. We've kind of had it implied in a couple of episodes that that's probably the case, but now we know for sure that that's the case.
Is this the first time we really get kind of confirmation that Dean remembers his time in hell?
No, we find that out in Lazarus Rising because Sam asks, and then he has like a flash when he's like staring in the mirror. He has a flashback, but it is like adding more that he obviously remembers more, like with what Lilith says, that it's not just like flashes. He has more of a memory.
Yeah, because if I remember right, for most of the first half of season 4, Dean is kind of trying to play it off to Sam, like, oh, it was all blurred to me. I don't remember any of it. Like, and Sam's like, well, that's probably for the best. And
yeah,
I feel like I remember this confrontation with Lilith being one of the first times that we actually realized, like, she's like, no, you remember all of it. And it wasn't just a year. It wasn't just 4 months. It was 40 years for you. Like, that's a big realization on the trauma that Dean's been suffering.
Yeah, and the fact that it's not something that's going to fade away quickly. Like he's spent almost twice as long in hell as he spent on Earth. Like it's not going to be something that's going to disappear from his psyche.
I feel like this episode also, his confrontation with Lilith, is kind of the first hint that we don't know what all Dean went through down there. Like, we have an idea that he was tortured because it's hell, and like we've seen flashes of him like in situations where it's like covered in blood and things like that, but I feel like Dean's been playing off or refusing to give any details and claiming he doesn't know, even though we can kind of tell that he is being haunted by those memories. But this is the first like hint and like a little suggestion that there's more to his time in hell.
Yeah, that there's more of a psychological element as well as a physical element based on like the things Lilith says. Like the way that Lilith, which is actually just a subconscious, is bringing up those things and pushing him to remember, is that like we're being told that it's he remembers, and or if there's stuff that he doesn't remember, it's because it's just pushed below the surface and it's not going to take much for it to come out and fully be in his conscious mind.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. On that very happy note, I had one like behind the scenes like location note, and it's just that there is some really pretty scenes that really showcase the Vancouver area that are really nice. And I always like really enjoy when there's the scene, I think it's towards the end, with Bobby, and there's just like this beautiful like forested scape behind them, and like it's just my favorite when I see those, because those are like those are like the woods that I grew up like looking out my bedroom window at, and they're gorgeous. And I also really loved that scene with Bobby. We didn't really talk about Bobby, but like I love Dad Bobby, and Dad Bobby comes in clutch. I don't know why they didn't call him earlier, but Dad Bobby comes in clutch.
Yeah, it's like, I also love the moment where we realize out of nowhere that Bobby speaks fluent Japanese. Yeah. He just whips out the Japanese, and Sam's like, okay.
I love that Bobby just shows up and instantly, I think Sam's just really grateful that Bobby's taken over. We talked about that already. Like, He's like, okay, you're in charge now, Bobby. You know more than me.
Yeah, I feel like there's a big relief on Sam's face whenever Bobby gets there and like takes control of the situation.
Yeah, suddenly Sam's like, oh, I don't have to be responsible for all of this on my own. And also like, Bobby, you know things, you know more things, which is, I love every time we find out something new that Bobby knows. And Sam and Ordine are both like, what? Bobby? I'm like, at this point, you shouldn't be surprised. Bobby knows more than you. Bobby knows more than John. Bobby knows more than everyone. Like,
yeah, Bobby knows more than either of them will ever know. They should just be like used to that by now.
Yeah, exactly. Bobby should be the first one you always call because the chances that Bobby's already solved this case is high.
I was thinking too, I actually noticed that shot you were talking about with the mountains behind them in that episode, because something that's always funny to me about Supernatural is someone who lives, I'm from like the upper South. I'm kind of from like where the South and the Midwest merge in the US, and I live in the Midwest now. And it's funny to me whenever they're trying to convince us they're filming in like Nebraska and you can see like mountain ranges behind them.
Yeah.
I'm like, this is so clearly Vancouver.
Oh yeah, when you're like, this is not the Midwest. I'm sorry, but Vancouver does not look very much like the Midwest. It just doesn't.
A lot of times, to their benefit, they do manage to find like back roads and things that do look very like rural Americana.
Very flat. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's definitely moments where they're supposed to be in like Kansas and you can see mountains in the background. And I'm like, I don't think that's Kansas.
Well, it's now time for our last and my favorite part of the episode, which is our character blessings. Would you like to start or would you like me to start?
I can start. I kind of already mentioned the person that I kind of honed in on this episode was Jessie. I really wanted to give her a blessing because she went out of her way to be kind. And I feel like those people, she's the kind of person who, when there's a group conversation happening and the group stops listening to you talk, she'll look at you and make sure you know that someone's still listening. That's how I read her character. Like,
she notices people.
Yeah, those people are worth so much. And she was clearly going through her own mental struggles and her own issues in her life that we don't see much of, but are hinted at. And she was still a kind person, and she didn't ask for all of this violence to happen essentially because of using her as an excuse for this violence. And I would like to give her a blessing that I wish we got more of her story, and I'm sure that she was a lovely person.
That's lovely. I'm really glad you blessed her for those reasons. Well, I'm going to bless Dean because he seems like the other character to bless in this episode particularly. Again, for kind of a lot of the things we talked about, he's dealing with like an incredible amount of trauma, and he's dealing with it very much alone because he doesn't feel like he can talk about what he's been through. He doesn't feel like anyone will understand. Again, he's like Sam's parent in so many ways, and you're not going to burden your kid with like your trauma, and he's not able to talk to Bobby. He's just like not been able to talk to anyone about it. And in this episode, he's just sort of like flung headfirst into that trauma, into like flashbacks of that trauma. And that's really, really tough. I think just a blessing for him in the vulnerability that he's sort of forced into, because like vulnerability like is often a place where really good things can happen, but only when we're actually like safe enough to be vulnerable. And he's like forced into being vulnerable without being safe. And I think I'm looking forward to like other moments in the show where he'll be able to be vulnerable and be safe, but that's not like where this season is at right now. And I think just a blessing for him in walking through that really, really tough place.
Yeah, I really feel like watching this again really points out how much Dean is actually going through. And he's been struggling with all of this trauma alone. And like you said, this wasn't him choosing to be vulnerable about all of those fears. He was forced into it before he was ready. And yeah, I really feel for him in this episode, because as much of his fears are made into a joke, both by the writing and by him, it's all very serious and very scary for him.
Yeah, exactly. Well, with those blessings, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for being here, Hayley. This was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Is there anywhere that people can find you on the internet? Anything you would like to share as closing thoughts?
You can find me on TikTok at Dean Apologist. I have not been extremely active right at this moment because I've been moving personally and I've had a lot going on. But usually I make consistent videos about Supernatural on there. And I'm not as active in the fandom on Twitter, but I'm on Twitter at DeanApologist _ because Dean Apologist was taken. Those are the only places I'm really active. I'm most likely to be able to interact on TikTok probably.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing. We'll put links in the episode description as well, so you can find them easily. Yeah, so if you want to hear more of our episodes, you can make sure you're subscribed to Saving People Queering Things wherever you listen to podcasts, and share the show with your friends who like Supernatural, or your friends who don't like Supernatural, and, force them to watch along with you. You can find all of our social media, including our Discord server, through our website, which is queeringthingspodcast.com. So yeah, you can be sure to ride along with us next week as we discover season 4, episode 7. It's the Great Pumpkin, Sam Winchester. Thank you all so much for coming along for the ride, and we wish you a peaceful road until we meet again.